Welcome back to the Web Fundamentals pathway. In this video, we're going to review or go over XXE room or XML external entity vulnerability. Basically, in this room, you will be learning the basic syntax of XML and how to construct an XXE payload. XXE is a common vulnerability in web applications in which an attacker can exploit a web application and view sensitive files such as the password file and possibly the SSH keys of the user. So let's go over that. In total, you have around 4 tasks to complete. The first 3 tasks are easy to finish. Technically, you will go over the 3 tasks, answer some easy questions about XML. If you know about XML, you can skip the first 3 tasks and directly can go over task 5, which is the exploitation part. If you don't know what is XML, or if XML is new to you, you can then start with task 2, and I will go over the answers here. So basically, full form XML is extensible markup language. Is XML case sensitive? Yes, it is case sensitive, since if I show you an example here, okay, so this example payload, if you write user info, here, user info is a children item, okay? If you write user info this way, with lowercase letters, or if you write it with uppercase letters like that, the complete code will be different. So you have to pay attention to the case sensitivity of the characters. Is it compulsory to have XML prologue in XML documents? So what is XML prologue? The prologue is the first line of an XML document, which states the version. For example, in this code here, the prologue is this line. The prologue states the version of the XML and states also the encoding. In this example, we didn't define the encoding, but normally you would see the encoding defined in the prologue tag. Can we validate XML documents against source schema? Yes, since all XML codes or files can be transferred between systems without the dependency on platforms. They work on all platforms, all programming languages. How can we specify XML version and encoding in XML documents? Of course, it is in XML prologue, as we saw in the example. DTD. So with what extension do you save a DTD file? Let's take an example of DTD file. So basically, a DTD file is a file that starts, or a file that has the shape such as this one. So it defines, as you can see, the root of the XML document. It defines the elements, and then it defines the children. In this example, the DTD file can be used to validate an XML document, okay? So basically, you have an XML document, and you have a DTD file. You can use the DTD file to validate that XML document to make sure it conforms to the rules set in that DTD document. Okay, so this example, the rules are the node should be the root element of the XML. The node element should have these 4 children items or elements. Now here are the specifications of every element. For example, here are the specification for the element 2. It should be PC data. Again, form, it should be also PC data, and heading should be the same also, but it should be PC data. So basically, PC data means parsable elements or items. So now, if we use, how do we use that DTD file to set rules for an XML document? As you can see in this example, we have the prologue set, the encoding and the version, and then we have the doc type, which states the root element of the document, and then we have system node.dtt. This line means that the root element of the XML document is node. As you can see, we use node as a root element. System node.dtt defines that the DTD file to use is node.dtt, and the content is here. And then we go over the root element that we set earlier and the children elements. Okay, so the extension of a DTD file is DTD. How do you define a new element? exclamation mark element. So here we define a new element by saying exclamation mark element, and we set the name of the element in the DTD file, of course. How do you define a root element? We define it by typing slash or exclamation mark doc type. How do you define a new entity? By saying exclamation mark entity. So payload. Okay, let's go over the exploitation now. So make sure to deploy the machine and access the web application here. So let me turn this off, reload the page. So normally, if you want to test a web application against XML external entity attack, you would need a payload area like input box or an upload area. So in this example, we have an input box. In other scenarios, you may be encountering upload areas. So you will be uploading your own XML payload as a file, okay? But in this example, we will be putting the payload directly in the input box here. Okay, so now let's see how a payload would look like. So if I go back to my notes, so this is example payload. Now, what is the purpose of this payload? So as you can see, first we have said that we have the doc type equal to replace, and the entity which is name has the value of feast. So the first line we define an entity called name, and we give it a value called feast. Now we go over the children items. So we have the first name equal Falcon, and the last name equal ampersand name. Here we are calling the value of the entity name. Okay, so when XML calls the entity name using this syntax, okay, the value will be displayed. So if we take this payload as is and paste that here, it should print out the name feast. Okay, now if you submit the button, as you can see, we see now the payload in a URL encoded form. As you can see, we have the Falcon feast printed out on the screen. Now, what if we want to take this further? Normally, XXE attacks would result in the attacker being able to view sensitive files, such as the password file or the private key of the current user. So right now, we have the user called Falcon. Supposedly, it's Falcon. We would like to access its SSH keys, but first, we want to make sure that Falcon is actually a user on the system. So what we would do here, we would get back and modify the payload. Let's take this one. So the payload here, as you can see, first we define the prologue. The version is 1.0. Then we define the root element. Right, the root element in this case is root. And then we have the entity, an entity called read. And we define the value of that entity by calling a file on the system. So we use the system here, keyword, to say that we want to set the value of the file read to an actual file on the system. And then we define the file that we would like to call. So the content of that file, okay, will be set to the value or to the entity read. Now, lastly, we put the root element that we defined earlier in the doc type, and then we put here, we call the entity read in order to display its value. So here we display the SSH key of the user. But first, before displaying the SSH key, you need to know what is the user, who is the user. So I know it's Falcon, but how do I know that? So technically what we do here, we would get back and type etc/passwd. Now when we submit, now we get the content of the password file displayed back. And on the last line, we see that there is an actual user called Falcon, and they have also bash as shell. So now we make sure that, or we confirmed our suspicions that Falcon is an actual user on the system. The next thing is we escalate the privileges, or we take the first foothold on the system by accessing the SSH keys of that user. So back to the original payload, instead of calling the password file, we call the private key of the user Falcon. Normally, the private key is located under the user home directory, the user and .ssh/idrsa. Now, if we submit this, we should get the contents of the private key back to us. Submit. As you can see, this is the private key returned to us. Now we can take the private key and elevate the privileges. So let's do that. Intercept, submit, intercept the response, and this is your private key. Take that, and let's log in. So, new tab, cd back. So here we create a file called nano idrsa. Set the correct permissions on the file. Now log in to your target using the private key that you just gained, and we take the IP address. Login, type yes, and we are logged in, as you can see, to the system. So we have escalated the privileges from a regular XXE attack to a remote code, or not remote code actually, to first foothold on the system. ID sudo -l. Okay, we don't know the password. So a password is required to perform sudo operations or perform sudo on the system. So in order to escalate the privileges, you need to enumerate the system and find an exploit to escalate the privileges. But that's not required on the current challenge. So let's get back to the room and see what are the questions. So try to display your name. Okay, what is the name of the user in the etc password? We saw it is Falcon. And what are the first 8 characters for Falcon's private key? Just copy the first 8 characters, which start from here all the way until 7. And by doing that, you complete the room. If you want to take it further, you can just do as I did, escalating the privileges or taking first foothold by accessing, as you can see, or logging in with the private key that we have just acquired. So that's it for today. I hope you like it and see you in the next video.